Well, thank you very much, James. Thank you, Alan, for making this possible. You're right, I just came out with a book, and I'll start off by saying a few words about what the book is about, and then I'll put out some ideas for how the challenge is moving forward. I think it's easiest to start by saying what the book is not. It is not a book about an organization. If you go to a bookshop, you can find a lot of books about ISIS. Even though the book talks about ISIS a lot, of course, but it was important for me to not only talk about an organization, because I genuinely believe that we're dealing with a movement. And one of the mistakes that we in the West made in 2011, when the leadership of Al-Qaeda had been eliminated, was to mistake an organization, or was to mistake a movement for an organization, and to believe that with the killing of bin Laden and with the elimination of the leadership of Al-Qaeda, the threat from jihadism had ceased to exist. And of course, it returned ferociously only 2 years later with ISIS. I do think it is possible that ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, will disappear, but that does not mean that the movement is gone. In fact, I'm convinced that in 5 years we will still be talking about a jihadist movement. I'm not sure we will still be talking about ISIS. So that's the first point. The second point is, it is not principally a book about the Middle East. There's a lot of books now out, very good books, that I would recommend, that talk about the origins of ISIS in Iraq and the historical evolution. What I wanted to focus on is really the situation in Europe, the threat against the West. And so this book talks about the implications of the rise of ISIS and of the jihadist movement to the West. And it talks not only about an organization that is ISIS, but it also talks about ideas and people. And the principal thesis of the book really is that this is a threat that will keep us preoccupied for a generation. And I'm making this statement because of, based on several points. The first point is that what we have seen over the past 4 or 5 years has been an unprecedented mobilization of people in the name of that movement. Since 2011, the Arab Spring, the chaos and instability that to some extent has resulted from the Arab Spring, or the negative consequences of the Arab Spring, the rise of Islamic State, the competition between Al-Qaeda and ISIS that we're seeing in different parts of the world, all of this has led to a mobilization that is greater even than the mobilization that took place in the 1980s in Afghanistan. According to the most liberal estimate of what happened in the 1980s in Afghanistan, 20,000 people from lots of different countries went to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets. Now, what we have seen in the last 5 years was the mobilization of more than 30,000 people in just 5 years from 100 different countries. And for the first time, we've in fact seen the mobilization of over 5,000 Western Europeans. 5,000 Western Europeans who have gone to Syria and Iraq in order to join jihadist groups, predominantly Islamic State, and some of whom will of course face exactly the same question that many people in Afghanistan faced at the end of that conflict. When the conflict in Afghanistan ended, the end of the 1980s, a lot of the fighters there were asking themselves, what now? And some of them initially went to Pakistan, to the neighboring country, stayed there for a bit, then went on to other conflicts in the Muslim world. Indeed, in the 1990s and 2000s, you had the so-called veterans of that conflict turn up in literally every conflict in the Muslim world, from Chechnya to Algeria to Bosnia to the Philippines even. And some of them, of course, grouped together and formed what became Al-Qaeda. And I'm spending so much time talking about this because the 9/11 attacks that were the culmination, if you want, of that, happened 12 years or 14 years after the end of the Afghan conflict. They had their roots in the Afghan conflict, but they happened 14 years later. And in the case of Syria, the conflict hasn't even ended. So the clock, if you want, hasn't even started ticking. And I do think that perhaps in 14 years' time, we can still expect to see terrorist attacks that are based on people that are today meeting in Syria. That's the threat of foreign fighters, but of course Islamic State has in many ways been more cunning than Al-Qaeda, because Islamic State has a two-tiered strategy. On the one hand, it is training and equipping people in Syria that it sends back in order to carry out attacks in Europe, as we have seen in Brussels and Paris. On the other hand, of course, it also encourages and incites people through the internet and through messages that are not even traveling to Syria, that are just simply enthusiastic supporters of Islamic State who are in Europe. It incites them to carry out so-called lone wolf attacks and to do things with very simple means, very simple but very deadly, as we have seen, for example, in Nice. I think until Nice, very few people would have thought it possible to kill 86 people by simply driving a car into a crowd. And this two-pronged strategy is in many ways very cunning, because on the one hand, it creates the constant fear of these returning fighters, which carry out very complex attacks, but it also maintains the level of fear at an almost constant level, because the threat has become entirely unpredictable. There is, however, now a third leg to that strategy, which we haven't seen materialize in Britain yet, but we have seen materialize in other European countries, which is the idea of what I call remote controlled attacks. And this is something that happened this summer in Germany, where you had two refugees who probably radicalized after coming to Europe, and who got in touch with ISIS through the internet, and who were essentially controlled via private messenger applications. So they were in touch with the central leadership of ISIS until the very moment of attack in real time. They were given instructions. So they were not entirely lone wolves in the sense that they were directed, but they had not really traveled to Syria and were not part of the movement. And I think this really raises the question as to what to do about applications like WhatsApp, which are highly encrypted and which for security services are very, very difficult to get access to, even for the Americans that have perhaps the best means of doing so. So I think those are the three levels of threat that we're currently seeing. Returning foreign fighters that may still be dangerous. We're continuing to see the threat of lone wolf attacks, and we're seeing perhaps those remote controlled attacks, and we will get more of them. Now, one of the questions that is often being discussed and that I'm often being asked about is what happens when the core territory in Syria and Iraq collapses? What about returning foreign fighters that may come back to Britain and other European countries? First of all, I do think that is a threat. However, I do not think that it is a sudden threat, and I do also not think that it is as massive a threat as many people describe it. I do think that right now there are still between 1,700 and 2,000 Western Europeans who are in theater, who are in Syria and Iraq. That's based on 5,000 Western Europeans who have gone over the course of the conflict. Maybe 4,000 of them have gone and joined ISIS. About a third of them have already returned. So this threat of returning foreign fighters is not a future scenario. It is not a hypothetical. A third of the foreign fighters have already returned to their home countries. About 15% have died. That takes out about half of them, leaving 2,000. Of those 2,000, up to 2,000 Western Europeans, I do think quite a lot will die in the final battles. We know that ISIS uses a lot of Westerners and a lot of foreigners as suicide bombers. And as we have seen over the past few weeks in the case of Mosul, suicide bombings are ISIS's preferred method of defense. And quite a few of them will die, and the rest of them, perhaps maybe 1,000 will be left, will initially go to Turkey. just like the Afghan foreign fighters in the 1980s initially went to Pakistan. They go to Turkey because that's the country from where they entered into Syria, and they will stay in Turkey and make up their mind. In the border areas in Turkey, which me and my colleagues have visited, there is the infrastructure of ISIS. There is a possibility to stay there initially. And I do think that of those 1,000, we will see quite a few turning up in other conflicts. We'll see quite a few turning up in other conflicts. And we will, over the course of next 5, 6, 7 years, also see some of them returning or attempting to return to their Western home countries. But this will not be a sudden move. It will not be a case of suddenly hundreds of jihadists knocking on Britain's doors. They do come back, but they will come back bit by bit and step by step. Some of them will be disillusioned. We know that because me and my colleagues have been in contact with some of the foreign fighters. Some of them will be disillusioned. They will be disappointed by what they see as a false promise of a caliphate that didn't live up to their expectations. Some of them will still be jihadist in terms of their mindset, but not necessarily act on it. But some of them, of course, will still be dangerous and will want to carry out terrorist attacks. And that will be, I think, the greatest challenge for security agencies in Britain, but also in other European countries, to be able to distinguish between those different groups. It is already the case that a lot of European countries are struggling with the number of cases that they have to deal with, that they have to prosecute. Hundreds of cases in some European countries that people that have been charged with incredibly complex legal proceedings about to unfold, because in many cases it is not possible in a court of law to prove that they were members of ISIS or what exactly they did in Syria. And it will be necessary to prioritize and to also, perhaps with some of the people that are coming back and that are clearly disillusioned, to either use them and make them work for the government, or perhaps to try to reintegrate them into society. So this will be complex, even though it is very clear that the threat will remain, and this will be an enormous challenge in years to come. And one thing that I want to say at the very end is that one of the, if history has taught us anything, it is that it would be completely wrong to think that with the defeat of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, ISIS will be defeated, or that the jihadist movement will be defeated. If the history of Afghanistan has taught us anything, it has taught us that with the end of the Afghan conflict in the 1980s, the challenge for us in the West only started to materialize. And to some extent, I do see history repeating itself in the sense that this will keep us preoccupied for many years to come. If you want to know more about it, read this book.